Hi, my name is Debbie, and I am obsessed with all things to do with ultrasound. I'm an empty nester who has spent the last 28 years scanning in all different kinds of situations: clinics, hospitals, point of service, emergency departments, private offices, echovascular, general, high-risk OB, and want to dive down deep into all things to do with technology, techniques, and transformation. It's time we take ultrasound to the next level. Think of this like your little power boost on your commute to all things ultrasound, along your way to the thing that we call work. So pull up a seat, make sure you're comfy, and be ready to be challenged and encouraged as we learn it's all about the frequency. Today's podcast, I'd like to talk about the Cavum Septum Pellucidum, the Cavum Vergae, and the Cavum Vellum Interpositum. These are three things, and then the absent Cavum Septum Pellucidum. These are four things that come up when we are looking at the cavum that are possibilities within things that are most common. And so we'd like to talk about their differences and the embryology of them and how they're similar. So we'd like to talk about the midline septum pellucidum. There are the three distinctions of the Cavum Septum Pellucidum, the Cavum Vergae, and the Cavum Vellum Interpositum. The Cavum Septum Pellucidum means translucent wall in Latin, and it measures typically 1 to 3 millimeters in diameter. The Cavum Septum Pellucidum is part of the limbic system. The limbic system function is to process and regulate the emotions and memory while also dealing with sexual stimulation and learning behavior. Motivation, long-term memory, and our sense of smell also regulate to the limbic system and its sphere of influence. So that's why the CSP is important to us. But it doesn't become fully developed until about 17 weeks. So we're not going to be able to see a fully developed CSP until 17 weeks. So before that, we won't be able to truly identify that. And then about 85% of the cavum septum fuse around 3 to 6 months after birth. So it kind of goes away, which was interesting to me. We look for the structure when obtaining a proper head circumference. It appears on ultrasound as like a box-like structure in the anterior brain at the level of the thalamus. More specifically, the cavity is sagittally oriented and has a concentration of cerebral spinal fluid that filters from the ventricles through the septal laminae. The cavum septum pellucidum is surrounded by all sides. Anteriorly by the genu of the corpus callosum, superiorly by the body of the corpus callosum, posteriorly by the anterior limb and pillars of the fornix, inferiorly by the anterior commissure and rotistrum of the corpus callosum, and laterally by the leaflets of the septum pellucidum. It is not a part of the ventricle system and does not communicate with the subarachnoid space. It is lined with glial, neuronal, and epidermal cells. The CSP cavity can expand to form a cyst. The definition of a cyst structure having a width of 10 millimeters or more in the septum's region. The walls demonstrating lateral bowing. No other definition differentiating a large CSP from a small CSP. There are two classifications of cyst in the CSP, communicating and non-communicating. This is dependent on whether it's communicating with the ventricle or not. There's not a lot of substantiated evidence to prove that the cyst caused symptoms. However, cysts can be post-surgery pressure or trauma to the head. However, there has been descriptions of symptomatic or asymptomatic cyst, with the symptoms being described as mental disturbance, ataxia, disordered speech, epilepsy, and bilateral pyramidal signs, chronic headaches, papilledema, emesis, syncope, cognitive impairment, emotional and behavior disturbance, and visual and sensorimotor findings. Yet, majority of cysts are asymptomatic. While scanning this myself, I have often thought that I was seeing the CSP, but in reality, I was seeing 3 white lines instead of the 2 box. And the line in the middle was actually the anterior portion or the roof of the corpus callosum. So it's easy to miss this or think that you're seeing it when in actuality, you're just seeing the roof of that corpus callosum. And so hopefully bringing this to our awareness, we're able to be more careful about how we see and view the corpus callosum. And sometimes I always like to just do a clip through the head when I'm done with all the anatomy in the head, because a lot of times just a still image of that CSP isn't going to really show you if it's a CSP or a Cavum Vergae or other things going on there. So a clip through that area might be helpful. So let's now talk about the Cavum Vergae. First described by a Dr. Vergae and oftentimes referred to as Vergae's ventricle. The Cavum Vergae is an extension of the Cavum Septum Pellucidum posteriorly past the columns of the fornix and the foramina of Monro. This is present in up to 30% of newborns, but persists into adulthood in less than 1% of individuals. Historically, the CSP in the Cavum Vergae was known as the 5th and 6th ventricle, respectively. This was later disrupted as these structures do not contain choroid plexus, so not a part of the ventricular system. This condition takes place when there's a septation of the leaflets of the septum pellucidum with a posterior extension of the splenium of the corpus callosum. Some have described the passage between these 2 cavities as Vergae's aqueduct. So sometimes when I'm scanning this, it's kind of, it looks like an elongated CSP as I scan superiorly through that CSP. So that's why I think always doing maybe a cine clip through that area is helpful. Next, I want to talk about the Cavum Vellum Interpositum. So the Vellum Interpositum is a space in the subarachnoid space between the connected fornix and its respective choroid plexus, and the choroid forming the roof of the 3rd ventricle inferiorly. It is an anterior extension of the quadrigeminal plate cistern located superiorly to the pineal gland. If this potential space is dilated, then it is known as the Cavum Vellum Interpositum. So during the early fetal stages of continuous layer of the pia mater enclosed the procephalon and the dicephalon. We learned this in embryology. As the brain develops and growing and covered cerebral ventricles of the forebrain overlap the pia mater of the 3rd ventricle. This causes double layering of the telecordia or vellum interpositum of the roof of the 3rd ventricle. The anterior aspect of the telecordia is closed and is at the foramen of Monro when the pia mater folds on itself. Then the posterior remains open. The formation of the Cavum Vellum Interpositum occurs. The potential space between the double layers of the telecordia creates the Cavum Vellum Interpositum that interact with the quadrigeminal cistern. The internal cerebral veins are situated between the 2 layers of the Cavum Vellum Interpositum, as is the posterior medial choroidal artery. So if we were to not see the CSP, what do we look for next? It's just like anything else. If we don't see it, then in one way, then we can look in different directions to confirm or deny the abnormality. So we have found that using power Doppler to find the pericallosal artery in a sagittal plane of the fetal head would be the next area of interrogation. The normal course of PCA, the pericallosal artery is defined as visualization of the artery emerging from the anterior cerebral artery running parallel to the corpus callosum. In a recent study, it's shown that in 98.8% of the time, the sonographer in this study, the sonographers were able to identify the pericallosal artery in the first 11 to 14 weeks of pregnancy. Then they reconfirmed it again at 20 to 22 weeks anatomy scan. So typically we're only checking the CSP at the 20 or to 22 week scan. And then if it's absent, we're doing the pericallosal artery. So it just might be another piece of information we can do in the first trimester to give us more information about what's going on or not going on with the baby, the fetus. Our differential diagnosis for all three of these, we would have to include, but not limit to, the vein of ganglion aneurysm, arachnoid cyst, or a dilated third ventricle. Usually we will do an MRI of the fetal head to help with the diagnosis of this. And obviously, location and as much information as we can get fetally, but using other modalities to help with the diagnosis of these things. So I hope that was a good overview or review of the Cavum Septum Pellucidum and the variants of that for us. And I hope maybe there was something in there that you learned or that you could take away. And I hope to see you in the next podcast. Thank you for tuning in to It's All About the Frequency podcast. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Share it with a friend, and remember to keep your frequency high.